Hello, Yakri here with another Warframe video. I'm actually here to talk more about the changes to beam weapons. I'm in a real mission, in which I'm having some trouble already. Because there are always people who complain if you only show examples in the simulacrum. And additionally, in the simulacrum, you can't really set up the kind of situation that I actually want to have, right, to talk about beam weapons. And really, like, because in the simulacrum, right, I've talked about this in my other video, where you can just go enemy to enemy and kill them, it makes it a lot easier, right? For the specifically, not like in general, right? Obviously, killing an enemy takes the same amount of damage in and out of the simulacrum. And for a lot of other changes, you know, it doesn't really make a big difference, right? But for the beam weapon changes, in particular, the way that they have been changed makes them less good when you're trying to, you know, evade enemy fire and not die and target specific enemies in a group of enemies, right? If I can just stand here and spray down one guy, this works pretty well. Although, note, these are level 40 enemies, right? I am in Tower 4 Survival, but still, level 40 enemies, and I was using this weapon in other examples, or in my previous video in the Simulacrum against level 125 heavily armored enemies, right? And so, jeez. This works fine if you can just spray down an enemy like this. But at the moment where you want to do something like try and aim glide around and hit guys, you're gonna miss a bit, right? Unless you want to claim you're some sort of esports legend, even if you're fairly good at these kind of games, you're gonna miss a little bit, right? And there's some amount of DPS lost to missing. Now the thing is that while you're missing, your DPS is linearly, excuse me, scaling down due to the ramp up, ramp down mechanic that is per enemy, not per clip, right? And if you have to change targets for whatever reason, or you accidentally change targets, then your damage is going to be further lost, right? Because as you change targets, you lose that high damage you had ramped up because it's per target, not per clip. Now, although they can ramp up and kill very high-level enemies very quickly, they don't kill low-level enemies a whole lot faster, right? I can't just clear out this group of enemies. If I had the Heck equipped, absolutely, I would have no problem just one-shotting these guys by the bushel, right? If I had the Lanka equipped, I'd be able to kill all of them in a single shot, probably, right? Whereas with this, it's a bit of a problem, even though I can, with the Synapse, mow down heavy gunners, right, as I start to build up procs over time, very easily. These guys, I'm having trouble. Why? Well, it's because of the ramp-up period. Also, because I gotta kill this 8 Corrupted Xmas, right? But it's because of the ramp-up period, and once the ramp-up goes, they just die. But that's the same thing for level 125 enemies. So it creates this interesting scenario where the Synapse is basically equally as good versus these guys as it is versus level 125 enemies, right? Whoops. So that's a bit of a problem. At least for, like, the overall value of this weapon, right? It makes it less good. And that's what I was kind of getting at when I mentioned that in real missions, this is going to be a little bit more difficult. I mean, this is a mission where I'm in by myself, right? Which does mean I'm in under a little more pressure to actually dodge attacks, especially since I brought in unranked Inaros for funsies. And, it does make it a little bit harder, but in a mission with 4 people, there's going to be more visual clutter, more enemies, and it's going to just make it even harder to actually aim at a specific target, right? Like, this is a pretty pathetic trickle of enemies. You've played the game too. You're aware, I am sure, that you're gonna have a lot more enemies in missions where you're actually, there we go, actually, you know, playing with other people, right? And yet, I'm still, I'm having an easy time here, but it's gonna be even harder, right? And even in this case, it's kind of bad because the ramp up makes it pretty awful versus lower level enemies. I mean, not awful, really. Obviously, I'm still killing them, right? And like I've mentioned elsewhere, and the Amprex, right, is probably going, and weapons like it, not that there's a lot like it, mostly the Atomos, is going to be less affected by these kind of changes, right? Because it will multi-target enemies, and you'll get that ramp up on the initial enemy and then kill everything else around them, right? When you take them out. So that'll make it a little bit easier for you. And so I just wanted to give an example in a real mission, because people always complain, you know, if you only do the simulacrum. And partly because I can't set up the right kind of scenario in the simulacrum, not just because you can't spawn enough enemies. So obviously the spawn rates for a solo mission are pretty shit. But because the simulacrum has a fucking terrible layout, and they don't allow us any other, like, you know, tile sets for it. So, yeah. Anyway, point is, this is where this nerf really comes in, right? Versus lower level enemies, you can't clear out big groups of them as easily as you probably ought to be able to for a heavily formatted, properly modded weapon, in my opinion. Like I said, it doesn't make, well, like I said elsewhere, it doesn't make beam weapons garbage or anything, right? It's just, there's a lot of people who are saying, like, this isn't a nerf at all. Whoops, I should have been healing myself. That's gonna get me killed. This isn't a nerf at all. This is no big deal. There's no problem here, right? There's a lot of people saying that, and I think this is what they're not taking into account. They're going into the simulacrum, like I demonstrated in the show, that all right, it can still kill enemies almost as fast. You kill maybe one high level enemy less in a clip, but you're still fucking killing level 120 enemies. There's no problem, right? Well, the reason that this is somewhat of a thing that I dislike is because of this kind of shit, right? Where I can't just, you know, mow these guys down in an instant with this weapon that's only really good at single target damage and is like heavily kitted out, right? I've got 5 forma on it. This really makes it not competitive with weapons like the Opticore, weapons like a gas proc Lanka, weapons like the Dread, even, because the Dread can in half a second kill any amount of enemies in a line at this level, right? And so yeah, this is about pretty much the same for different types of beam weapons. I mean, it's going to be better for the, whatchamacallit, the Amprex, right? But, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of the changes for this reason, and this is the real, like, nerf, right? This is the real issue you're going to run into. The real issue is not that they can't kill high-level enemies quickly. The real issue is that they've been made, the utility has been made worse against low-level enemies, right? And mid-level enemies. And it is even worse against high-level enemies. Like I mentioned in my other video, like once again, I could probably have killed one more enemy in an ammo clip previously, which is actually, you know, that's a pretty substantial reduction in the effectiveness of the synapse. And in the effectiveness of base, probably every other beam weapon that is not going to multi-hit, like the Amprex does and like the Atomos does. So yeah, that's the real, like, that's where the real nerf comes in, right? Is in these sort of situations where you can't mow down a big group of enemies that you could really easily do with a ton of other weapons in the game. Even weapons that are, like, relatively slow firing single shot weapons. Like think about the Sancti Tigris, right? That's going to be able to handle level like 40 and 50 enemies better than the Synapse. And it's still effective against high-level enemies as well if you mod it correctly. And the same goes for a lot of other top weapons in the game. Now, I don't know if these really have to become top weapons, but I would have liked to see at least the best beam weapons really be contenders for top spots, and hopefully more than just the Amprex because of its, like, high crowd clear. Because, I don't know, it's more variety to the game. There hasn't been much reason to build any of the beam weapons for years, and, I don't know. When they initially made the changes that really put beam weapons, especially weapons like the Synapse and the Phage and not the Amprex, in a position of being what's the word I'm looking for here? Very good, right? It put them in a very good tier, and they've kind of bumped it down to a more reasonable tier. But unless they tone down some of the other, like, really rock solid weapons of the game that are better at doing what the beam weapons are good at, and then also better at other things because they're long range and because they're high damage per hit. Unless they tone down those weapons, I don't really see this overall balance change getting beam weapons where I personally would like to see them, so that I can feel good about using them frequently in missions and formatting the crap out of them, especially the beam weapons that were on the lower end of usefulness to begin with, because like the Amprex, of course, was a top tier weapon at one point in time, and it's largely because of its actual firing mechanic, and so now that's why it's still good now. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Yakri out.